All right, so we're going to start today with studying philosophy, and within philosophy, we're going to really be studying phenomenology. And phenomenology is when people use that word, they typically associate it with Edmund Husserl, uh, who's thought of as typically referred to as the founder of phenomenology, or the father of phenomenology. And that was the name he used to describe his own philosophical practice, his own philosophical method. Here's in his books, so it comes out in his books, Logical Investigations and the Ideas Pertaining to a Pure Phenomenology. Here's his definition of the core principle, what he calls the principle of all principles. It's from section 24 of the first book of the Ideas. And this is the basic principle of phenomenology. He says the principle of all principles is that every originary presentive intuition is a legitimizing source of cognition. And he clarifies that everything originarily, or so to speak, in its personal actuality, offered to us in intuition, is to be accepted simply as what it is presented as being, but also only within the limits in which it is presented here. That's the technical definition of the core methodological principle of phenomenology. And earlier, this is back in section 19 on page 36 of Kirsten's translation. He gives a little, he says something that helps clarify a little bit what that means. Similarly, obscure language for me just to read it, but I'll read it anyway. He says, genuine science and its own genuine freedom from prejudice require, as the foundation of all proofs, immediately valid judgments which derive their validity from originally presentive intuitions. I'm not going to go on and explain those things now. I may come back and do it later. But I want to quote those things first because those things essentially define what the project of phenomenology is. Phenomenology is then something that has a number of other. So those are those books. The books in which Husserl presented this book, Ideas, is from I think 1913, and Husserl launched a philosophical tradition. Some of the main other hugely prominent figures who are basically followers in that tradition are Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, various others. But I name those three, Heidegger, Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty, because each of them has a sort of a shatteringly powerful book that reshaped and redefined thinking and other things. Also in the 20th century, Heidegger's book Being and Time from 1927, I guess, and then Sartre's Being and Nothingness and Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception from the 1940s are other huge books in the tradition of phenomenology. So typically, if you study phenomenology, those would be the books that you'd read. So again, just thinking about what phenomenology is, on the one hand, it's rooted in that principle that I read from Husserl, which I have not explained, but I've read it. So Husserl names a basic methodological norm that has to be followed if you're going to get truth, if you're going to have science, if you're going to have knowledge. This is what you have to do. That sort of defines what phenomenology is. But then also these other figures who followed him and who are also universally recognized as phenomenologists and who saw themselves as continuing in Husserl's tradition and so on, and who described their own practice as phenomenology. They, carrying out that same principle, have done massive investigations and shown you something of what that principle means. And so when you study those people, you learn what it is to engage in philosophy as a phenomenological practice, or phenomenology as a philosophical practice, however you want to put it. Why do I start like that? Well, because if you learn from them what phenomenology is, you might or might not conclude that they're doing something new. Husserl certainly thought he was doing something new. I think Heidegger thought he was doing something new. I think Sartre thought he was doing something new. I'm not so sure about Merleau-Ponty, whether he thought he was doing something new. But those other three, I think it seems pretty clear that they did. But we can ask that ourselves. We can say, well, now that we've seen what you do, what is phenomenology? It seems to me that there's lots of creative, original, and in that sense, new work going on in what they're doing. But it seems to me that the essential thing that is phenomenological practice is not new with them. And so I think you can see it in lots of places, but I think you can especially very powerfully see it in Kant's philosophy and in the German idealist philosophers who followed Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, the prominent ones, and less prominent ones as well. So I'm not going to try to go on and prove all those things, and I don't much care about what conclusions you or anybody else come to about things you want to say about the history of philosophy. What I do want to do, though, is look at particular places in Kant and Hegel where it seems to me you clearly see phenomenology as the meaning of that has been revealed in those 20th century figures, where you clearly see phenomenology being practiced. And so that's what we're going to do. So we're studying philosophy, we're studying phenomenology, but we're going to study phenomenology by taking a route that's a little bit unusual compared to what I think most people do in university classes when they study phenomenology. Is we're going to read some significant chunks of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, some significant chunks of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, and then some significant chunks of Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. So, I mean, it's not odd to read Merleau-Ponty. It's a little bit odd to read Kant and Hegel in a phenomenology class, unless, somebody were reading them to say, here's something different from phenomenology that we're changing from, or something like that. That's not what we're going to do. We're going to read them because we're going to see the phenomenology being practiced in those books. And as I said, my purpose here is not to make I'm not trying to make some point about the history of philosophy. I'm actually trying to learn something. We're trying to engage in phenomenology and help you to engage in phenomenological philosophical practice. And also I'm trying to read and understand those books by Kant and Hegel. So I don't have some larger thesis about the history of philosophy, and I'm not interested in that. But what I do want to do is look at places where we can understand what Kant is doing, or what Hegel is doing, or what Merleau-Ponty is doing. And in doing that, we're going to learn something about what phenomenology is. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to start with Kant. And in a little while, a few minutes, maybe quite a few minutes, we're going to turn to the section in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason called the Paralogisms of Pure Reason. And we're going to turn to that section from the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, which is often called the A edition, published in 1781. And we're going to look at the fourth paralogism. Now, I'm going to use Kent Smith's translation of Kant. There are lots of translations around. This one's not new, but for many reasons, I find it one of them, probably the most useful one to use myself. There are various things to criticize about it, but I find it a very useful translation. In any case, that's what I'm going to use. And the point I want to make here, the reason I bring it up, is I said we're going to read the fourth paralogism. And that starts on page 344 of this book. So why is that interesting? Well, because I think if you're going to try to understand Kant, that's where you have to start. It's a little bit funny. It's a little bit funny to start a book on page 344. Usually you pick up a book and you start reading from the beginning. And I think that from the point of view of understanding Kant, that's often, this book anyway, not a good practice. Kant, you've probably taken university courses from different professors, some of whom were quite good and some of whom were quite poor. I don't think that in his presentation and his writing, Kant would be like those good university professors. I think he'd be like those poor ones. In other words, I think that Kant doesn't do a very helpful job of introducing his philosophy from a pedagogical point of view. I think though the sentences he says are true enough, and though he has a reason for saying them in the order he does, of course, because of the things he's engaged with and so on, I think that his approach to presenting his own philosophy kind of obstructs grasping what it is that he's trying to say. And through my efforts at studying this book over many years, I have come to conclude that the best place to start the book is here on page 344. So that's what we're going to do. Of course, others have studied the book as much or more than I have different views. That's fine, but that's where I'm going to start. And so, so that's our goal here in this first little installment. But before jumping to that, I want to go somewhere else to try to just get us introduced to what phenomenology is as a philosophical practice. And to do that, I'm going to turn to two other writers, Aristotle and Hume. That's what we're actually going to start looking at books. And I'm going to read you a couple of passages from them, and I just want you to notice how different they are. How different they are. Oops, that book is falling apart. Sorry. Okay, so let me find Aristotle. It's around here somewhere. I brought all my books to this desk, but here we go. Here's Aristotle. I'm going to start. In this book, I'm going to start on page 1129, but that's a different story. Anyway, we're going to start in Aristotle's Politics, book 1, chapter 2. I'm just going to read you one of the most famous passages in Aristotle. This is on page 11129 of this particular collection of translations. But the proper thing is it's book 1, chapter 2, marginal number, Becker number 1253A, I guess around line 8, something like that, 1253A8. And Aristotle says, now, that man is more of a political animal than bees or any other gregarious animals is evident. Nature, as we often say, makes nothing in vain, and man is the only animal whom she has endowed with the gift of speech. That's all. A few words. Boy, one of the most powerful and most talked about passages anybody ever wrote in human history, I'm sure. There's a lot packed into those few remarks. I'm not going to try to unpack it because we're not studying Aristotle, enjoyable as that would be. I just want to read you one part again and make one point about this. So he's talking about human beings, right? He says, man, I mean, anthropos, so he means the species. He's not talking about men as opposed to women, mankind, humankind. So that humankind is more of a political animal, that the humankind is more of a political animal than bees or other gregarious animals is evident. So he's comparing human beings, a naturally occurring type of or animal species, with other ones. Man compared to bee, human beings compared to bees. And he says, man is the only animal whom nature has endowed with the gift of speech. We could look at the translation and look at the actual Greek and get his words more exactly. But it doesn't matter for our purposes. The thing I'm after is, first, man is the only animal whom. Man is the only animal whom nature has endowed with the gift of speech. So man is more of a political animal than bees. Man is the only animal whom nature has endowed with, blah, blah, blah. So my point in both those things, the thing to notice in both those things is that you're looking at a bunch of things, all the different kinds of animals, and you're comparing this one with those ones and saying this one is, with respect to some particular thing you're comparing them, this one is different in this way. More of a political animal has logos, these ones don't, has speech, these ones don't. So just think about that methodologically. Think about that as a way of approaching. He's trying to understand lots. In this particular case, he's trying to understand politics, but more basically, he's trying to understand human beings. And that's what this part and many other parts of Aristotle's writings are about, trying to understand who we are. Trying to understand, and I'll emphasize that word. Well, first of all, he says man, right? Mankind. Like he's talking about the kind of thing we are. And then he talks about nature. Nature makes nothing in vain, and man is the only animal whom nature, has endowed with this, right? So he's talking about what human nature is. He's talking about the essential thing you have to turn to, the basic thing you have to turn to understand what kind of being we are. So how does he approach talking about human nature? Well, he contrasts it with other natures. He contrasts it with the nature of the bee or other gregarious animals, or the flocking animals, animals that come together. And again, he says we're the only one with speech. Others have mere voice, he says. Whereas mere voice is an indication of pleasure or pain, and therefore is found in other animals, the power of speech sets forth the expedient and the inexpedient, what's useful and what's not useful, and therefore likewise the just and the unjust, right? What's good and what's not good. And speech does that. Again, super interesting things to say, but we're not going to talk about that. But again, he's saying, other animals have voice, we have speech, articulate speech. So again, thinking about this as a method, you're trying to think about what human nature is. You're trying to think what we are. And what Aristotle does is he looks out in the world, sees the types of things they are, and classifies them. This is we're this kind, they're that kind. In fact, it's a pretty good procedure. Aristotle is extremely good at it. Aristotle's writings are full of everything you can imagine, but he's very centrally oriented towards the observation of nature, especially the observation of living beings, animals, biology, plants and animals, but especially zoology, I guess, the observation of animals more than anything else, and humans within that. But Aristotle is an amazing observational biologist, or we could even just say an observational naturalist, because he's also an amazing analyst of weather and stars and so on. And so, that's one of the most profound and maybe the most basic method there is to look at the natural world, observe, and observe doesn't mean casually glance around. It means to, in a disciplined way, try to take account of what you see and organize and analyze and systematize what you see and so on, to thinkingly grasp what you perceive in the natural world and to try to understand the terms by which it works. That's what he does. So, you should look at that and think, yeah, that's a great method. And indeed, let's even just dwell on that just a little bit longer. What do? You spend a lot of time with dogs and you watch them and you kind of start to figure out what a dog is like. Contrast it with a cat. You spend lots of times with cats, you figure out what they're like, and you learn, this is what dogs are like, this is what cats are like. Give the dog a bone, give the cat a mouse, I don't know, different things. Similarly, you can observe people for a long time, and you can start to see what it is that people do, what they need, what they like, what their hang-ups are. I don't know, what else are you going to do, right? And how else are you going to find that stuff out except by observation? And that's what Aristotle is really good at, and that's what he's doing here. So that's how Aristotle starts, and that's his approach to determining human nature, to look at different things in nature, different animal species, and to try to find out something about what defining powers differentiate them. And he basically says the defining thing about the human being is it's an animal with logos. We're an animal, we reproduce sexually, we have to have food, we die, we grow like other animals, we have sensation and all that sort of stuff. All the other things he would note as definitive of animals in general. But we have this power of articulate speech and all the things that come along with that, reasoning, carrying on history, telling stories, lots of stuff. That's the specialist power that we have. Sorry, I was interrupted there a moment by my son coming to get a pair of socks. Anyway, so that's Aristotle and human nature. He picked a good spot because I just finished that. Now I want to turn to a very different passage. It's no surprise to say that. I want to read you just a little bit from Hume's Treatise of Human Nature. Notice the title, A Treatise of Human Nature. And here's where he begins. All the perceptions of the human mind resolve themselves into two distinct kinds, which I shall call impressions and ideas. Now, that's an interesting first sentence to make in your treatise on human nature. Aristotle started by looking at bees and saying human beings are different in this way. Hume says all the perceptions of the human mind resolve themselves into two distinct kinds. What does he say? I mean, I'll read you a little bit about what he says. And again, we're not going to dwell on it, but it's worth thinking about it a little bit. He says, so we have impressions and ideas. He says, those perceptions which enter with most force and violence we'll call impressions. And under this name, I comprehend all of our sensations, passions, and emotions as they make their first appearance in the soul. By ideas, I mean the faint images of these in thinking and reasoning. Well, that's interesting. So there's the contrast. So it seems like the core difference there is between something in a way that strikes you immediately, and that is constitutive of the very flow of your experience, and then something else, which is you're drawing upon that reflectively, thinking and what was it? Thinking and reasoning, yeah, and thereby having a kind of reconstruction of some version of what happens originally. And then he says within both impressions and ideas, he says there's another division of our perceptions which it is convenient to observe, and this extends both to our impressions and ideas. The division is between simple and complex. Simple perceptions and impressions are simple perceptions or impressions and ideas are such as to admit of no distinction nor separation. The complex, on the contrary, are those which can be distinguished into parts. And then he gives a couple of examples. I want to get the complex impression. I think the complex impression is the one where he says you could see it if you look at an apple, you get a whole bunch of different things all at once. I can't find it immediately. It's not that important. Anyway, I mentioned that. Anyway, he goes on about this. His discussion of this is quite interesting, but we're not going to study Hume, just like we weren't studying Aristotle, so I'll try not to get caught up in the details. But basically, he says there's a priority of impressions compared to ideas because you can't really have anything in your ideas that didn't originally come to you in your impressions. So let me read this. Now I'm reading this edition, the Oxford edition, the cover off. At the bottom of page 6, we're still in section 1 of book 1. He says, blah 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 blah. The principle of the priority of impressions to ideas must be understood with another limitation, namely that as our ideas are images of our impressions, so we can form secondary ideas, which are images of the primary. Ideas produce the images of themselves in new ideas. But as the first ideas are supposed to be derived from impressions, it still remains true that all our simple ideas proceed either immediately or immediately from their corresponding impressions. And then the next sentence, the first sentence of the final paragraph, this then is the first principle I establish in the science of human nature. So I'm not going to read any more of that, but I'll draw your attention to that. He wants to talk about human nature. And the thing he's talking about is, first of all, the different kind of vivacity with which we're struck by impressions or ideas, which is more or less defined. And this special focus on the difference between the sort of immediate flow of experience and our reflections upon it, what comes from that. It would be delightful to study Hume. Almost as delightful to study Aristotle. Not many things are better than studying Aristotle. Not many things are as good as studying Aristotle. But studying Hume is pretty good. Think there about the thing. He starts off with a contrast of ideas and impressions. Aristotle starts off with a contrast of human beings and bees. It's quite a different thing. And I asked you to think about what Aristotle's doing, and I described the kind of observational process. And I think, what's Hume doing? Hume isn't going out into the natural world and looking at the different things you find there and classifying them one separate from another by their characteristics. Hume is turning to the flow of his own or the flow of our own experience, the very way our experience unfolds, and discovering a distinction in there between different species of experience. Aristotle's finding different species of animal, Hume's finding different species of experiences, or something like that. So it's that difference that I really want you to notice. And that's the first point. There's going to be 2 points. That's the first one. And so it would be worth just spending more time talking about it, just to underline how striking a difference that is. And in the terms in which we typically talk about these things, we could roughly contrast that as a method that initially begins by turning outward and a method that begins by turning inward. We'll see soon enough that that's actually not a very good description, but don't worry about why it's not a good description now. Let's begin by thinking about it as if it were a good description, right? Because it helps you to see how strikingly different these two things are. Aristotle starts by looking out in the world and finding different kinds of things and differentiating different worldly realities. Hume starts by looking at the very form our experience takes, and he looks at different facets or different dimensions of our experiencing. I said there were 2 points. That's the first one. The second one, now I have to remember. What was the second point? What was the second point? I'm just going to pause this for a second until I remember. Oh, yeah. The second point is that it's not only do they look in its way to different places, but I also want you to notice that the distinctions are of a different kind. I mean, they don't feel like they're quite the same fabric. You have animals, and you look at their capacities and their behaviors. You can distinguish different animals by the kind of eggs they produce, or their mating patterns, or their nesting patterns, their eating habits, right? And that's not the particular thing he's drawing out with the human being and saying it has logos, although those things very similar that do come up. But that's the sort of thing you're distinguishing there. When you're distinguishing ideas and impressions, like you're not distinguishing the kind of eggs something makes. You're not distinguishing the kind of nest something makes. Right? It's a totally different kind of thing. And so I used this expression before, fabric. It's like the fabric of nature and the fabric of the flow of experience are a very, very different sorts of things. And that is, I think, the corollary, however you like to pronounce it, or I'm not sure that's quite the right word, but maybe it's the sort of next thesis that's implied by that first distinction of where we're looking. And he makes that, this is a point, Hume, one of Hume's most famous things is his discussion of necessary connection. I won't go into that in any kind of detail. I'm going to quickly find it. Page 155 in this one. So I'm going to read you the beginning from section 14, book 1, which is of the idea of necessary connection. He says, having thus explained in this manner, having thus explained the manner in which we reason beyond our immediate impressions and conclude that such particular causes must have particular effects, we must now return upon our footsteps to examine the question which first occurred to us and which we dropped in this way, namely, what is our idea of necessity when we say that two objects are necessarily connected together? Idea of necessity. Upon this head, I repeat what I have often had occasion to observe, that as we have no idea that is not derived from an impression, we must find some impression that gives rise to the idea of necessity if we assert that we really have such an idea. So the thing we got from chapter 1 was that basic principle, something like Hume's principle of all principles, that there's nothing in ideas that doesn't come from impressions. So he says we have an idea of necessity. What impression did that come from? What is the experiential resource that has contributed the meaningfulness to our idea of necessity. Now, Hume's analysis of that is very famous, and it's relevant to what we're going to talk about, but I'm not actually going to pursue it. But I just wanted to mention, to bring that out to you, because it helps to underline something of the weight of this striking difference I was pointing to between Aristotle and Hume. When you think about nature, and this is going to come up again pretty soon in a different context. When you think about nature, you think about causal relationships, the force of gravity, magnetism, electricity, those kinds of things that explain why when you plug this little piece of metal into the wall, a light comes on, or why when you let go of an apple up in a tree, it falls to the ground, those sorts of things. We talk about the causes. When we talk about nature, we talk about those things. We talk about them as realities. If you want to, why did something happen? You say, oh, gravity made that happen, or whatever it is. Right? When you're describing experience, is a different thing. We're talking about necessity again, but we're talking about our idea. But when you think about necessity, or when you impute necessity to something, when you imagine you're recognizing necessity, the question isn't about the powers that are affecting those things. The question is about what it is that makes it possible for you to have that experience. And as Hume has said, our ideas derive from our impressions. So the question here is, how from the form in which the flow of experience happens can, or does it come to be the case that we have an idea of the necessary relationship between two things? We think that way. It's a notion we use. Where does that notion come from? It doesn't come. It's not. It's one. The rate at which this apple falls and collides with somebody's head is going to be explained by gravity. Our coming to have the idea of gravitational force is not going to be explained by gravity. That's not a gravitational phenomenon like the falling of an apple is. Right? Gravity doesn't, for lack of a more complex sentence, doesn't cause apples to fall and cause the idea of gravity to come into being in your mind. Right? The kind of process that is involved in the falling of an apple is very different than the kind of process that is involved in the coming into being of a notion, of a form of experiencing, or something like that. So I said that the second point I really wanted to draw out was the very different terms in which relations of ideas and impressions have to be understood compared to the terms in which relations of natural beings are understood, relations within natural beings are understood. And I'm using Hume's famous and pivotal example of necessary connection to draw that out. That it may well be the case, to use the example people like to use, that there's some kind of physical force that is responsible for why when one billiard ball hits another billiard ball, that second billiard ball moves in a predictable way. But that's not what's making you have the idea of necessity. That's not what's making that experience come about in your consciousness. So that's the last thing that I want to say here. It's just, I was talking about the shift between Aristotle and Hume, and the real thing that I'm trying to emphasize there, at the level of method, the level of how they approach answering the question, and both of them have the same question there: what is human nature? There could be other questions too. That's the question they both have. The different starting points are, to stick with the metaphor I used before, one is, so to speak, external and worldly, the other is internal, experiential. But that difference in starting point also is a turning to a different kind of fabric, a different kind of reality. And the terms in which one of those realities is articulated and explained the terms are very different from the terms in which the other reality is articulated and explained. The terms, the concepts, the ideas we use to make sense of nature are not like the terms, the concepts, the ideas we have to use to make sense of the fabric of experience. So that's my first point. So I'm going to stop there, I'm going to pause, and I'm going to come back, and we're going to talk about Kant. Yeah, okay. So Kant. So what we're going to be doing with Kant and with phenomenology is basically the thing Hume just introduced. So the basic project Hume identified is more or less the project of phenomenology. It's the project of describing experience in the form in which it actually happens and staying committed to the terms that are the terms of experience, the terms in which experience unfolds and makes sense, not jumping to the world of which we have experience and using the terms that describe the relationships between those things in the world to try to talk about our experience. We're going to try to talk about experience on experience's own terms. And I want to start, as I said, with the fourth paralogism from the A edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, because I think that does a very good job of giving us that first principle for how to think about our experience. So these are called paralogisms. What are paralogisms? Well, they're things that pretend to be syllogisms but are bad. So the study of the paralogisms is a study of some bad arguments. Things that masquerade as syllogisms, things that masquerade as good arguments, but are in fact fallacious. So sophisms. This is the fourth one, and Kant calls it the fourth paralogism of ideality. This is, as I said, on page 344 of Kemp Smith translation. In the A edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, it starts on page 366 in the German. He calls it the fourth the paralogism of ideality. It doesn't mean very much. As I said, Kant is not pedagogically very helpful for a lot of us. I would describe this in quite different terms. I would describe what he's going to do here as a critique of representationalism. So it's commonly the case that people, philosophy professors and others, think of our experience as providing a representation of the world. And that's actually that notion is what he's going to say is wrong. So I'm going to go through it. So he starts in this section not by giving his own argument. He starts by giving the bad argument that he's going to show to be bad. So it's important to know that he doesn't even really quite tell you that he's going to do that. And so I think many readers are led astray because they read this argument and they think, oh yeah, that's a good point, that's a good point, that's a good point. But they're actually all the things he's criticizing. And then it gets kind of confusing if you got taken in by the first thing. You don't really quite know what's happening. Anyway, so he's going to present an argument, and he's saying, this is an argument we hear all the time, and it's an argument we generally believe, but it's a phony argument. It doesn't work, and he's going to show you why. And as part of his larger project is to say something about why we get caught up in this argument. I don't think we're going to get into that. We might, but that's not my concern right now. Anyway, so what he's going to do is he's going to present the argument and talk about it a little bit and why it's wrong, and then he's going to go through and say, look, here's how you really need to think about things and so on. So that's what we're going to get to. So the first three sentences are the false argument. I'll read it out loud to technical language, but he says that the existence of which can only be inferred as a cause of given perceptions has a merely doubtful existence. That's premise one. Premise two, now all outer appearances are of such a nature that their existence is not immediately perceived, and that we can only infer them as the cause of given perceptions. That's premise two. So therefore, conclusion, the existence of all objects of the outer senses is doubtful, and then there's a little further thing. That's the false argument. So that thing right there, you could take it and write that down. That's the argument. He's saying, you've probably heard it a million times, you probably believe it, it's wrong, and he's now going to show it's wrong. So then the next thing, which is called the critique of the fourth paralogism of transcendental psychology, which is basically 3 paragraphs, is him going through that argument and talking about what's said there. And then starting on A369, there's a paragraph that begins, before exhibiting our paralogism in all its deceptive illusoriness, I have first to make a remark, That paragraph is where he now starts talking about his own thing. So that's where things really get going. And we're just going to read a little bit of it. But now, what is this argument? Well, what is this bad argument? The bad argument is the one that you've heard surely since your first philosophy class. Probably thought of yourself in grade 8 or high school or something. And that's the idea that, you can ask yourself, how do I know that the external world exists? You ask yourself that question, first of all, and then you come to the conclusion that you can't answer it. You don't know. You can't prove that the external world exists because all you know are your own experiences, and you don't know if the world out there corresponds to the way you experience things. And so you don't know if this representation you apparently have of the world corresponds to the way the world really is. That sounds intuitively plausible to people, and that's what he's calling the fourth paralogism. So he says, so what we normally think then is that, through our eyes and our brains and so on, we're related, perceptually related to a world that somehow causes us to have the form of experience we do. We have these ideas, we have these thoughts or whatever, but then we say, well, how do I know that the way I'm experiencing things corresponds to the way things are, or even if there's anything out there at all that corresponds to these things, right? So that's what he means when he says in the first sentence. This is the thing that he says. Well, I guess the first 2 premises. I'll start with the second premise. All outer appearances are of such a nature that their existence is not immediately perceived. The things outside us that seem to appear to us, we don't immediately perceive those things. On the contrary, we only infer them as the cause of the perceptions that we do have. We say, oh, I'm seeing this thing that looks like a tree because a tree is causing me to have that perception. Then he says, but that, the existence of which can only be inferred as a cause of given perceptions, has a merely doubtful existence. If all you have is the perceptions and you have to just infer that there's a thing out there that's causing them, then you don't have direct experience of it, so you don't know that it exists, so it can be doubted. Somebody could say, well, maybe it's not there. And he says that, so the conclusion, therefore, the existence of all outer objects of the outer senses is doubtful. So my point there was just to show you that familiar thing we say, that's the argument he's making in the fourth. That's the argument that the fourth paralogism is making. So now he wants to talk about why that's wrong. And I think I might have to read one more sentence first. Yeah, I think it's important that we see that we use the word idealism here, which is what he's talking about. So the fourth paralogism, remember, is of ideality. That was the title. And so now he's going to talk about what idealism is. And so he says, he's going to call this doctrine that, all we have is our perceptions. He's going to call that idealism. And he says, so you might think that the idealist is the person who thinks, oh, all you have is what goes on in your experience and there's no real world, right? So some people perhaps do believe that. But he says, well, the term idealist does not in and of itself imply that. The term, this is right at the end of A368, right before A369. He says, the term idealist is not therefore to be understood as applying to those who deny the existence of external objects of the sense, but only to those who do not admit that their existence, the existence of those external things, is known through immediate perception. and who therefore conclude that we can never, by way of any possible experience, be completely certain as to their reality. Well, so that's what he's been talking about. But now his thing. He says, so before exhibiting this false argument, our paralogism, in all its deceptive illusoriness, I have first to remark that we have to distinguish two types of idealism, the transcendental and the empirical, and this actually matters quite a bit. So by transcendental idealism, now that's what he's actually going to call his own philosophy. And what I'm going to be saying here is that what he's talking about there is basically what we mean when we talk about phenomenology. But we'll get to that. Anyway, he says, by transcendental idealism, I mean the doctrine that appearances are to be regarded as being, one and all, presentations only, not things in themselves, and et cetera, et cetera. So first of all, I should say this. I like reading Kemp Smith's translation, but I really don't like one thing, and that's that he translates the word Vorstellung with the word representation. And I think that's it's understandable why someone would do it. And there is a kind of English idiom in which it makes sense, but I think it's mostly a disastrous translation. I think the correct way to translate Vorstellung in this context is presentation. And for a number of reasons. But why? Well, because I think, as I said, I think this whole section is a critique of representationalism. It's a critique of the idea that our experience is a matter of representations. And so it's pretty disastrous if the technical term Kant is actually going to use to describe the form our experience takes is translated as representation. It doesn't need to be, and I think it's wrongly translated that way. I think it should be translated as presentation. And so his point is, what is experience like? Well, things are presented to you, like you see things. Your experience is the happening of something being present to you, something appearing. So experience is a matter of presentations. And we can talk about what those different presentations are. It's very similar to what Hume said when he said we have impressions and ideas, and we're going to distinguish them by looking at, how much vivacity or whatever the word was he used, these things are presented to us. But the point there is emphasizing that issue of the fabric that I talked about before, right? Our experience is, so to speak, made up of presentations. That's all that's ever going on in your experience, is that you're experiencing something. Something is appearing. Something is being presented, and you can't ever get away from that. At every moment, this is what is being presented in your experience. Like right now, I'm sitting in this room looking at the computer, looking at these books, whatever. I hear my son talking downstairs. I have a stuffy nose. Lights coming in. That's happening. And if I walk over to the other side of the room, different things are going to be what is present to me. Right? And my life is always going to be that. And even if I stop, if you ask me a question, I stop to think about it. It doesn't stop the flow of presentations. It doesn't mean that I stop experiencing the light and stop feeling my stuffy nose or whatever. My attention may be oriented towards what I'm thinking about, but that stuff keeps happening, right? And that's the form our experience takes, the ongoing presentation. And we're, as Hume instructed us to, we're going to analyze presentations. So Kant says, by transcendental idealism, I mean the doctrine that appearances are to be regarded as being one and all presentations only, right? He's saying, that's what we have to do. We have to turn our attention to looking at what's happening as presentation, as a happening of experience. And that's the level at which our analysis is going to take place. And he says that is what transcendental idealism, or his philosophy, means. But he says to this idealism, to this transcendental idealism, there is opposed to transcendental realism. Actually, I should have read a further sentence then. So he says, transcendental idealism says that the appearances are to be regarded as presentations only, not as things in themselves, not as things existing by themselves. To this idealism, there is opposed to transcendental realism that regards them, he says time and space, but I'm not going to emphasize that in a minute, as something given in themselves independently of our sensibility. He's not interested in the moment at making any claims about the ultimate reality of time and space or anything else like that. He's saying, or things or whatever, he's saying, when you turn to your experience, right now I'm experiencing myself in a room. There's a book away, a little ways away from me. There's light coming through the window. He's saying, yeah, you have to recognize that as experience that's happening now. And don't confuse that with simply talking about the sun, right? The experience of the sun is not quite the same as just talking about the sun and so on. So Transcendental Realism, he says, regards those things as given in themselves and as existing in themselves. And he's saying, no, what we're going to do is we're going to strictly attend to the form our experience takes. And we're not going to say, we're not going to pretend, oh, I'm not talking about an experience of the sun when I have an experience of the sun. It's just the sun. There just is a sun there. There may well be a sun, but it's a very different kind of philosophy to imagine that you can just start talking about the sun in itself, start talking about this room in itself. That's very different from the thing that says, oh, the form my experience takes is I'm experiencing a room, I'm experiencing the sun. And so he says Transcendental Realism, and the way I talked about Aristotle basically sounds like that. Transcendental Realism just starts by talking about the world we have experience of as if it existed on its own without reference to our experience, and we just start talking in its terms. And that's what he's not doing. He's going to talk in the terms of us experiencing it. So the Transcendental Realist thinks, oh, those things, everything just is independently of our experience. So then, but then once you've said that, then you have to try to figure out what our experience is. And so the Transcendental Realist thus interprets outer appearances, that is to say, things that appear to be outside us, as things in themselves that exist independently of us and exist independently of our sensibility, of our experiencing, and which are therefore outside us. And then Kant has this little qualifying thing, and he says, notice this phrase outside us is being interpreted in a certain way. It's being interpreted in conformity, he says, with pure concepts of understanding. You don't need to know that, but notice that he's saying, he's just drawing your attention to that phrase outside us and saying, oh, there's an interpretation happening at the level of the use of that word. And you're going to see that the issue kind of hangs on that, on sort of equivocating, ways that we can equivocate on what outside means. Anyway, he says, so the interesting thing is, it's that Transcendental Realist, the person who starts off by asserting the unambiguous real existence of things outside us and disregards the fact of our experience of them. It's that person who ends up becoming what he calls the empirical idealist. So he says, it is in fact this Transcendental Realist who afterwards plays the part of empirical idealist. Because he says, after wrongly supposing that objects of the senses, if they are to be external, must have existence by themselves, he finds that, judged from this point of view, all our sensuous representations are inadequate to establish their reality. Right, so he says, basically you have an experience of the world. And then you say, oh, there's a world that exists independently of me. And then suddenly when you've said that, you say, well, how do I know that my experience ever gives me the world the way it is? It's the thesis of Transcendental Realism is the first premise or the precondition for that paralogism. It's the first premise for that argument that says, I'm stuck in my own experience and I can't ever get out to those things in themselves. So basically it's by assuming / asserting that there are those things independently of us that we produce the argument that proves we have no business asserting or assuming that. But he says then the transcendental idealist, and this is now where it gets to be important, the transcendental idealist, which is to say Kant, can be an empirical realist. So the transcendental realist has to be an empirical idealist. The transcendental realist, who posits the independent existence of things, has to say our experience is a closed box and we can't tell if we're getting to real things. So we have to say what we experience in our experiences is not what is real. It's only our representation. It's only our own, for lack of a better word, ideas. And so it's an empirical idealist. So he says, why is the transcendental idealist able to be an empirical realist? That is to say, that someone who can say that, no, in my experience, I experience real things. He says that's because for the transcendental idealist, the word external, we call things external, not because whatever we're talking about stands in relationship to objects that are, in themselves external, but we call something external because we're talking about something that relates perceptions to space in which all things are external to each other. Let me read a little bit more. From the start, we've declared ourselves in favor of this transcendental idealism, and our doctrine thus removes all difficulty in the way of accepting the normal ways of talking about reality. He says, and we can external things, or what we normally call worldly external things, are thereby proved in the same manner as the existence of myself as a thinking being is proved. So let's go on with that. He says, if you think of the way your experience happens, he says, there can be no question that I am conscious of my presentations. These presentations, and I myself who have the presentations, therefore exist. So you can't deny the existence of the presentations because that's what's actually happening, right? Your experience is presenting. That's what's happening every second of your actual existence. And the very nature of presentation is that the form presentation takes is that it's presented to you. So for anyone for whom presentation / experience is happening, that person is ipso facto having experience of themselves as an experiencer. You might not know what you are. You don't have some deep insight into yourself or whatever, but rather the very form experience takes is that it is being had by someone, or it is experienced for someone who is experiencing. And that's why there can be no question that I am conscious of my representations, because these presentations and I myself who have the presentations automatically, I shouldn't have said because, these presentations and I myself who have the presentations therefore exist, right? You as the one having presentations are performed in each moment of experience. Right? But then he says, and that's basically a version of the argument Descartes gave. Descartes' argument has more other issues involved in it, so I don't particularly want to get into that. That would also be interesting. But the point is, you should be familiar with that kind of argument. I think, therefore, I am argument. Just in that very basic sense that the simple having of experience means you're aware of yourself as the one having it, and you can't have experience and without meaningless self-contradiction deny that you're having it, right? But so here's the important point. He says, so let me read back again. He said, the external stuff is thereby proved in the same manner as the existence of myself is proved. So we just saw how we prove ourselves. And notice that proof wasn't kind of a theoretical derivation. It was the recognition of what is immediately already involved in the thing that's directly in front of you, right? The existence of yourself is immediately proved by the form the immediate happening of your experience takes. He says external things are proved in exactly the same way, right? And so he says external objects, bodies, however, are mere appearances and are therefore nothing but a species of my presentations. Okay, that's irrelevant. This is the next thing. Thus, external things exist as well as I myself, and both indeed upon the immediate witness of my self-consciousness. So what does he mean by that? He means the same thing I said before, just flip to the other side. For experience to be happening, it's always an experience that's happening for you. But for experience to be happening, it's also always an experience of something happening. And what that experience of is not you. It's you experiencing something else. You experience something that the very form of which is that it is external to you. And more exactly, he said that the only real difference between the immediate proof of the outside and the immediate proof of you is this. The only difference is that the presentation of myself as a thinking subject belongs to inner sense only, while the presentations that mark extended beings, bodies, belong also to outer sense. In other words, you, the very way you recognize yourself is as the one who is the having of the experience. So you don't exist somewhere else. You exist only as the temporal flow. You only exist in the temporal flow of experiencing. Whereas the very way you experience bodies and things is that they are spatially distributed outside you. The point is, that's just the form your experience takes. The form your experience takes is of bodies in space. And the form your experience takes is the presentation in a temporal flow. So time and space are the very form your experience always takes. Space is always the form that the object of your experience is presented to you as. You are always experiencing space. You are always experiencing spatial world. And you are always experiencing that in a temporal flow. And it is in that temporal flow that you find yourself as the one who is the having of it. The one who saw this a minute ago and who's seeing this now. And so he says, and that's really the only difference, is that you appear only internal to that flow, whereas bodies appear in space. So he says the only difference then between, so let me go back and read. He said, the external is thereby proved in the same manner as the existence of myself as a thinking being is proved. There can be no question that I am conscious of my presentations. These presentations and I myself, who have the presentations, therefore exist. The external things exist as well as I myself. And both, the external things and I myself, exist indeed upon the immediate witness of my self-consciousness. The only difference is that the presentation of myself as a thinking subject belongs to inner sense only, while the presentations that mark extended beings belong also to outer sense. In order to arrive at the reality of outer objects, I must just as little need to resort to inference as I have to resort to it in regard to the reality of the object of my inner sense. There's no trying to deduce that something is outside you from your experience. No, the very form your experience takes is it gives you something as outside you. So there's no inference at all. That's the thing that rests on the immediate witness of your self-consciousness. So he says, I have just as little need to resort to inference as I have in regard to the reality of the object of my inner sense. For in both cases alike, the objects are nothing but presentations. It's just the form your experiences take. They're nothing but presentations, the immediate perception of which is at the same time a sufficient proof of their reality. So the transcendental idealist is therefore an empirical realist. That is to say, the very form our experience takes is that we experience something outside us as real. The transcendental idealist is therefore an empirical realist and allows to matter as appearance a reality that does not permit of being inferred, but is immediately perceived. And let me read a little bit more now. There's a couple pages further on. This is now right before A374. Just about 3 lines up, he says, perception exhibits the reality of something in space. And in the absence of perception, no power of imagination can invent or produce that something. So I just want to talk about that idea that our immediate perception, our immediate experience presents something real in space. And I guess for that, I just want to talk about the distinction between imagination and perception of the real. I could ask you to imagine a beach, imagine a snowstorm, take your pick. Imagine you're doing this or that with your favorite person. Like, do whatever you like. You know what it's like to imagine. And the point is, that's not what it's like to experience something as real. Indeed, that's precisely what we contrast with experiencing things as real. Reality has a meaning, right? The meaning of reality is it's that way that in our experience we are confronted with something immediately and directly that we have no choice about, and that exists with a form of its own, independent of what we might want or will or wish. Right? When you imagine things, I said imagine at the beach. Well, then I say, okay, but it's a beach on a rainy day, and you think, oh, that's funny. I was imagining it with the sun before. Now you imagine the rain, and I say, oh, and by the way, there's nobody else on that beach. So maybe you were imagining people there before, so you have to erase them all, right? In imagination, the form the object of your imagination takes just is whatever you put in it. But that's not what happens when you open your eyes and see what's real in space. And similarly, not only does the form of the thing you imagine vary with what you put in it, it only has in it what you put in it. And so if you hadn't bothered to think about what color the sand is, or if you hadn't bothered to think about what was over on the hill, or if you hadn't bothered to think about this or that, that's just undetermined. But the real object is wholly determined. It's everything is filled in, right? Whether you want it or not. So we experience things as real. That is to say, the very form our experience takes, in exactly the same way that the form our experience takes is that it is of an I, it's of someone having it. In exactly analogous way, the form our experience takes is that it is of, maybe I shouldn't have said of an I, I should have said for an I. That was of in a sense of a subjective genitive. It was experience for an I. It's an I's experience, but it's also the experience of the real. It's an experience of something spread out in space, and where that something is precisely given in experience. The very way it's given in experience is that it is not defined by our subjectivity. It exists on its own according to its own rules. So as I said, he said, I read that one sentence. He says it again on the next page. Perception, therefore, presents something real in space. Stellt etwas Wirkliches im Raum vor. It gives you something actual. It doesn't give you something that you just imagined, that just could be there. You are confronted with what actually is on its own terms. And it's a complex world. It's many things distributed in space. There's something there, there's something there, there's something there, there's something there. And those many things distributed in space are things like rocks and trees on a hill on a sunny day, right? They're things that have, like a tree, they have a kind of internal integrity. Is a tree differentiated from a rock, and they're in relationship to the sun? Like basically the real that's presented to you has a form as well. And to take a long story and make it short, it's nature. You experience exactly that thing Aristotle was talking about. The form your experience takes is that the natural world is directly given to you. Anyway, so he says, I'll read the beginning of A375, just a concluding thing. All outer perception, therefore, yields immediate proof of something real in space, or rather is the real itself. In this sense, empirical realism is beyond question. So I'm going to say a few more things, but that's basically the point I want to get to, right? That your experience is not a representation. Your experience is the having of a real world. And it's radically distinguished from what it's like to represent something. You can close your eyes and try to make a representation of what you just saw. You can imagine something, but that's the exact opposite of what living experience is like. Living experience is the direct and immediate giving of a world that is not defined by you. The object of your experience is given as not defined by you, but as defined by itself. And it's this multiple, organized, complex world spread out in space and time. And moreover, it's spread out in space such that the space you encounter isn't limited by just the part of the space that you see. The very way you see space is that it goes on beyond whatever space you happen to be encountering. The very way you encounter time is that it goes on beyond whatever time you're going to encounter. Let me go back and read a little bit from the Transcendental Aesthetic, which is where Kant does start, and it's not a bad starting point, but it's better after you do the critique of representationalism that I was just talking about. So we'll just read a little bit now from the Transcendental Doctrine of the Elements. First part, Transcendental Aesthetic, where he basically is going to talk, he's asking, how do we have an experience of space and time? So remember, with Hume, he said, well, we're going to have these experiences, but we have to talk about how we can have them, right? We're not talking about what happens in some putatively, transcendentally real world. We're talking about the fact that our experience takes certain forms, and if something's going to happen in our experience, we have to be able to explain in the terms of experience how that could be there. And Kant says, well, let's talk about our experience. And we've just been doing this. What form does our experience take? A real spatial world is immediately given to us. Well, for the moment, we're just going to talk about space. Real actually adds something else that maybe I'll come to a little bit later. But for the moment, just space. We're given a spatial world. So he says, what's that like? And I want to take you to it's in A and B. So B37, it would be A22. This is the section called the Metaphysical Exposition of the Concept of Space. Don't worry about the words of the title. Basically, he just gives you a description of how we experience space. He says, by means of outer sense, which is a property of our mind, we present, not represent, we present to ourselves objects as outside us. It's the very nature of our experience. We don't know how it works. Mind, think of mind in a very broad sense of just experiencing. The nature of our mind or of our experience is that it presents objects to us as outside us. Presents it. That's the where it starts. Things are given as outside. And then he describes it. He describes 4 features of the way space is given. I'm just going to skip over the first 3, but I'm just going to read you the 4th because I think this one is so immediately compelling. Space is presented as an infinite given magnitude. Later, around A519, B547, you might think his own language would have made it better if he chose the word indefinite rather than infinite, but it doesn't matter for our purposes. Space is given is presented as an infinite given magnitude. The very way space is given to you is as infinite. So he's making a point very much like the one he made in the Paralogisms about inference. He's saying you don't see things and think about it and conclude or infer that space is infinite. No, the very form in which space presents itself to you is as infinite. What that means is any time you experience space, you are always experiencing that space as having another space beyond that, which would have another one beyond that, which would have another one beyond that. It's not a theory. It's not a thought. It's just the form your immediate experience takes. Now you might say, am I right to think of space that way? Don't worry about it. We're not asking that kind of question. We're just trying to describe the form experience actually takes. And the form experience actually takes is that space is given. It's presented as an infinite magnitude, as something that goes on infinitely. Let me go back and read that principle about principles from Husserl again. Remember he said, every originary presentive intuition is a legitimizing source of cognition. In other words, everything originally offered to us in intuition is to be accepted solely as what it is presented as being, but also only within the limits in which it is presented there. Well, that's what Kant is doing. He's saying, when we're going to talk about anything, we're going to talk about our experience, we're going to talk about reality, whatever we want, we have to start from talking about the form our experience takes. And we actually have to be honest about that. So we have to honestly describe the form in which it actually happens. We can't ignore it, and we also can't forget the fact that we're talking about experience and imagine it's more than that. We have to take it in the form it's given and hold it within the limits within which it's given. And that means we say space is the form our experience takes, and it is given as an infinite magnitude. That's phenomenological description. It was phenomenological description when he said, I immediately find myself in the happening of my presentations. It was phenomenological description when he said, I'm immediately given a real world in space. So that's what he's been practicing in all of these passages we've read, and that's what he's turning to. And the thing he's showing you in all those cases, as I said, is that these are not representations. It's not like we sit there and where we get a bunch of colors and shapes and sound and sort of construct something and say, I wonder if the world outside that was giving me this experience looks like this. We don't try to represent something. On the contrary, the very form our experience takes is that we are presented with space as an infinite magnitude. And then beyond that, in fact, the thing in space that we're presented with is the real world of nature, as I said. We'll later go on and talk about a little bit more about what's involved in that. But what I really want to do today was just introduce simultaneously Kant and the idea of phenomenology as this commitment to the description of lived experience, the form in which the living flow of our experience happens, where it is our job to describe accurately the form that our experience takes, and then to remain rigorously bound by the fact that all we have to go on is our experience, and so we can't just make up claims as we want to based on what we see in experience, but we must stay bound by the terms that experience itself allows. But as Kant did, we must also be attentive to what is immediately shown within that experience. Let me see if I can find that. Yeah, remember Kant said, Husserl said in that passage I read from section 19 of Ideas, he said, genuine science and its own genuine freedom from prejudice require, as the foundation of all proofs, immediately valid judgment which derive their validity from originally presentive intuition. Well, so Kant in the fourth paralogism started from an originally presentive intuition and then brought out the immediately valid judgment that I am perceiving and the immediately valid judgment that a real world in space is what I perceive. And the point I'm trying to, or there is a real world, whatever. I'm trying to put in the form of a judgment. The object of my experience is a real world. The relevant point I'm trying to make there is that the validity of those claims was immediate, right? That was the point he made. There were no premises and mediating steps of inference. Given with the fact of experience is the truth that you're experiencing a real world of nature and the truth that you are a subject experiencing it. So I'm going to stop there with the Kant for now. I'm going to just read one more thing from a different author in a minute. But that's the basic thing I wanted to cover. So I wanted to start with the Hume and Aristotle just to contrast these different starting points and to think about what it would be like to give a science of human nature starting in Hume's place. That is to say, to talk about what we are, not by finding us as one being in nature and contrasting us with other beings, but by defining us as the kind of reality that is found in experiencing, the I that's found in the fact of experiencing. And then to turn to Kant and see him doing that very thing, where he argues that we find ourselves as already involved in the world of nature, already wrapped up in it, experiencing it. So we'll talk more details about that next time. But he looked to originarily presentive intuition, right? Just the initial presenting of experience, and saw what was immediately inferred by that, and showed both that our knowledge is not representational in that sense, but also showed that we don't have to reason to an external world, and that kind of paralogism is based on thinking that your experience is like imagination, but that's not what it's like. Your experience is like perception. Experience is like the perception of the real. And his point then was that paralogism rests on a kind of equivocation. The very form your experience is given is that you're kind of thrown outside yourself. The outside is given to you in experience. So the reality of experience is that in and out aren't just two separate things. The outside is in your experience, or to be in your experience is to be thrown outside. And so that paralogism relies on kind of dishonest use of the word outside, that sort of tries to throw you outside the domain of experience. So it wonders whether outside the domain of experience there's reality, but the external world it's looking for outside the domain of experience is precisely the external world that's given in experience. So you need to reflect on that a little bit, on the ambiguity is right word, but maybe not quite a good enough word. Let's stick with equivocation, the two equivocal senses of in and out that operate within experience, and those are it's confusion about those that produces the pairing of terms that are transcendental realist and empirical idealist, two problematic views, in contrast to the correct view of transcendental idealism, which is empirical realism, right? Which is the transcendental idealism, this is what I'm calling the phenomenological perspective, is the one for whom experience takes the form of experience of the real. Anyway, that's roughly what we've been doing. I want to just read one more passage now. This is from Sartre's Being and Nothingness. Well, I actually have two more things to say. I want to read from Sartre's Being and Nothingness. I just want to read a little passage where he, this is on page 11 of the introduction in Hazel Barnes' translation, which is, all these translations are quite imperfect, I got to say, but they're good enough for our purposes. Page 11. So this is the third paragraph of this section on the nature of the percipere, and part 3, the pre-reflective cogito. Anyway, Sartre says, all consciousness, as Husserl has shown, is consciousness of something. This means that there is no consciousness that is not a positing of a transcendental object. In other words, a recognition of something that transcends you, that is outside you. Or if you prefer, consciousness has no content. And now he's taking up that sort of empirical idealist view. Like, it's not like you have some representational content in your mind. You're just thrown outside yourself into a world. Consciousness isn't a little ball of it's not a little fishbowl in your mind. Consciousness is being thrown out into reality. Blah, blah, blah. So he says about halfway down that paragraph, all consciousness is positional, positing, recognizing. All consciousness is positional consciousness of the world. It's positional in that it transcends itself in order to reach an object, and it exhausts itself in this same positing. So that's the point I want to bring out from this. There isn't anything else. There just is the experiencing of a world, right? It's not like you find something else that is you. You find yourself having the experience. You find yourself as the having of the experience. But there's no little room you can retreat to, which is you as an experiencer. Any more that you can step outside your experience to get into some real in itself. There just is experiencing, which is being thrown into the world. And there is nothing more to it. So that's the sense in which consciousness transcends itself. It's a throwing out, but there is nothing more to it. It exhausts itself. That's enough. There's more that I could read you from Sartre there that's basically the same as what Kant was saying. But I just wanted to read that because I think that notion that experience simultaneously transcends itself and exhausts itself is just a helpful way to hold on to thinking about what the very form experience takes is like. And the last thing I want to say now is just to go back. The cover image for this little video is the Frederic Edwin Church painting in the Andes, the heart of the Andes. And I just want you to look at that because I think looking at that painting, there are many things you can take out of that painting. But one thing is you can see that's basically what your everyday experience is like. In other words, your experience isn't being caught in a bubble where you're trying to figure out, does this piece of my representation fit this in the world? The very form our experience takes is that we are thrown out into that world of nature. We find ourselves encountering a spatially ongoing world of mountains and trees and vines and rivers and so on. We can talk about that more later, but I would say go back and look at that picture in light of the things we were saying and use it as a thing to remind you of what the form your immediate experience actually takes is like. Right? Hume said he wanted to turn to the form our immediate experience takes. Well, our immediate experience takes the form of seeing things like that. And we can use that painting again to explore a little more fully what some of the things are that we find in experience. Okay, that's it. That's it for our first little lecture, which was on the fourth paralogism and a little bit of the transcendental aesthetic. And then we'll move on to some more things in Kant next time.